Have you ever fixed something broken, not because it was worth saving, but because you were? This is the story of a woman who lost everything, her career, her home, her trust in people, and found herself rebuilding engines on the side of forgotten roads. One rainy afternoon, she helps a stranded stranger, unaware he's the CEO who once signed the paper that ended her life as she knew it. What follows isn't revenge. It's redemption. It's about second chances, quiet forgiveness, and learning that even in the rust, there's still something worth saving. If you enjoy heartfelt stories filled with healing, love, and hope, take a second to subscribe and stay for the journey. This one might just stay with you long after the final chapter. Now, let's begin. A struggling woman fixed a stranger's car unaware he was the CEO who fired her. The rain came down in sheets, steady and soft, as if the sky itself had grown tired of holding back. Maggie pulled her hood tighter, wiped the mist from her, fogged glasses and leaned under the rusted hood of the broken-down Honda Civic. Steam curled from the engine like breath in cold air. The woman who owned the car, a mother with a toddler in the back seat, waited anxiously under a dripping umbrella. "It's just a cracked hose," Maggie called over the patter of rain. "Cheap fix. Give me 10 minutes." The woman's shoulders sagged with relief. "You're a lifesaver." Maggie gave a half smile and reached for her tool bag, stashed under the open hatch of her RV parked nearby. The old Winnebago, patched with duct tape and hope, had become her home and her garage. Rolled into one, it wasn't much, but it kept her on the road and out of reach, from memories, from judgment, from the version of herself she used to be. 10 minutes later, the Civic coughed to life, and the little boy in the back seat clapped his hands. The mother offered to pay, but Maggie waved her off. "You've got a kid and a job to get to. Pay it forward." She watched the car pull away through the drizzle, tires hissing on wet asphalt. Then finally, alone again, she exhaled and leaned against the RV. The rain washed gently over the roof, a soft percussion that made her feel less like a drifter and more like part of the landscape. That's when she saw the other car, a black luxury sedan, sleek and incongruous in this remote New Hampshire back road, sat idling with its hood up about 50 yards down the shoulder. Maggie squinted. The driver, a tall man in a long coat, stood beside it, umbrella-less and examining the engine like he was trying to read a foreign language. Another one. Just her luck. She grabbed her tool bag and trudged over, boots kicking up water. "Trouble?" she asked, stepping under the hood without waiting for permission. The man startled slightly, then turned. His face was partially shadowed beneath the overcast sky, handsome in a tired, well-worn sort of way. Late 50s, maybe early 60s, his eyes, grey-blue, studied her like he was trying to place her. "Won't start," he said simply. "Battery." Light came on, then everything just died. Maggie tapped a wrench against the frame. "Well, let's take a look, shall we?" He stepped back and she dove in. It didn't take long. A faulty alternator, judging by the symptoms. She tightened a few connections, cleaned the corroded terminal with a brush from her back pocket, and after a few minutes, asked him to try the ignition. The car roared reluctantly. To life, sputtered, then settled into a steady hum. "Impressive," he said. Voice edged with something between gratitude and curiosity. "I get that a lot," she replied dryly, wiping her hands on a rag. "It's not brain surgery, just takes time and listening to the engine." "You do this often?" he asked. "Only when the universe parks broken cars in my path." She meant it as a joke, but his expression remained thoughtful. "You live around here?" Maggie gestured to the RV. "That's home. I travel, fix cars, drink too much gas station coffee. Try to stay out of the way." He looked at the vehicle, taking in the handmade shelves, the neatly folded tarp, the faded bumper sticker that read, "Good engines deserve second chances." "Sounds like a quiet life," he said. Maggie shrugged. "Quiet has its merits. There, Was a silence between them then? Not awkward, but filled with something unsaid. The kind of silence that passes between strangers who somehow know a little more about each other than they should. Then she caught herself staring. "Battery's not going to hold," she said quickly, stepping back. "You'll want to get a new alternator soon." He nodded slowly. "What do I owe you?" "Nothing. Just keep jumper cables in the trunk next time." He smiled, and for a split second, Maggie thought there was something familiar about it. Not the smile itself, but the way it lingered like it had meaning beyond the moment. "I'm Paul," he said, extending a hand. Maggie hesitated, then shook it. "Maggie. Thank you, Maggie, for the fix and the generosity." She gave him a half nod and turned to leave, but he called out just as she was halfway back to the RV, "You ever think about going back to working in a shop? You've clearly got a talent for it." Her back stiffened slightly. "Used to be in the business, not anymore." "Why not?" Maggie turned, rain trickling down her hood and dripping from her chin. She considered brushing him off, but something about the way he asked, not pushy, not condescending, made her answer. Sometimes the place you gave everything to decides you're not worth the trouble anymore. After that, you either stick around and drown, or you drive. He didn't reply, just stood there, quiet and still, as if her words had struck something inside him. Maggie climbed into her RV, fired up the engine, and pulled away. Behind her, the black sedan sat idling in the mist, and Paul watched her go, his hand still warm from the shake. He remembered that voice. He remembered the day she left the company, but Maggie didn't remember him, and that was the part that hurt the most. The coffee was too hot. Maggie blew on it anyway, watching the wisps of steam rise into the cold morning air like ghosts. She sat on the small step just outside her RV, wrapped in a threadbare flannel blanket, staring at the endless line of pine. Trees across the gravel turnout. Mist clung low to the ground. The world was quiet except for the faint click of cooling metal under the hood from the repair job she'd finished an hour earlier. Solitude wasn't just a lifestyle anymore. It was armor. So when she saw the black sedan roll in again, her shoulders tensed. It stopped 20 feet away, headlights cutting through the fog. The engine died. A moment passed. Then the driver's side door opened and Paul stepped out, holding 2 paper cups of coffee and a brown paper bag. Maggie narrowed her eyes. "Don't tell me that alternator already gave up," she called. He smiled. She noticed it was smaller this time, less practiced. Still hanging on, figured I'd give it a break and let the driver stretch his legs. He walked toward her and extended the coffee like a peace offering. Cream, no sugar. Took a wild guess. She eyed it, then took it. Lucky guess. I brought muffins too. Figured it was only polite since you saved me from a tow truck and an afternoon of waiting in the rain. Maggie took the bag with a sigh and motioned toward a folding chair, just outside her RV door. Paul sat gingerly, as though afraid the chair might protest. He looked around, at the carefully arranged tools, the faded photos pinned inside the RV window, the canvas canopy overhead. "This is yours?" he asked. "All. Mine, custom built, cost me less than a year's rent in the city and gave me twice the freedom." He sipped his coffee and nodded thoughtfully. "It's peaceful." Maggie leaned back. "It's quiet. There's a difference." Paul didn't reply right away. He looked like someone used to filling silences, but uncertain whether this one needed filling. "I used to be someone else," she said suddenly. "Back before the road." Paul looked at her but didn't interrupt. "Used to wear a blazer. Used to know everyone's name in a company with 6 floors. Thought I mattered." He waited. "I worked in automotive design, safety systems. Spent 2 years fighting for a redesign that would have added $50 to the final product, but could have saved lives. They said no, too expensive. I escalated it, filed a report, got called difficult, got let go." She paused, sipped. her coffee, watching his reaction from the corner of her eye. He remained still. "Funny, isn't it?" she said. "You think being good at something protects you? That doing the right thing will count for something." Paul's voice was quiet. "Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Doesn't mean it was the wrong thing." Maggie turned toward him. "You sound like someone who's said that a lot, to himself." He smiled faintly. "Maybe." They sat in silence again. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the tarp overhead. "Anyway," she said, brushing off her knees, "I left. Packed what I could into the RV, hit the road. Figured I'd go where people needed help and didn't care about resumes or titles. Turns out engines don't judge you. They just need to run." Paul looked at her with a kind of quiet reverence. Not pity, she'd have picked that up and shut it down instantly, but genuine respect. It disarmed her more than she liked. "I'm sorry that happened to you," he said. "Truly," she nodded, accepting the sentiment without responding. He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather notebook, worn at the edges. "I write things down sometimes, thoughts I want to understand better." Maggie raised an eyebrow. "A journal? Of sorts. More like a map, a way to figure out where I lost track." She looked at the book. "Doesn't help much if you don't name the roads," Paul smiled. "Sometimes names aren't the problem, sometimes it's the direction." She stared at him for a long second. "You always talk like that." "Only when I'm nervous." That surprised her. "Why would you be nervous?" He didn't answer, just looked out toward the trees. After a while, Maggie stood. "Well, Mr. Philosophy, thanks for the muffin." "Paul," he corrected gently. "Just Paul." She nodded but didn't offer her name again. "Not yet." He got to his feet slowly, as if not wanting to go but knowing he should. "Mind if I stop by again?" he asked. "If I promise not to bring muffins every time?" She hesitated. Everything in her wanted to say no. Solitude was safe. People had expiration dates. Relationships came with expectations and detours, but something in his voice wasn't. Rehearsed, and for reasons she didn't want to name, she said, "Sure, if the coffee's hot." He smiled, that small, honest smile again, and walked back to his car. As the sedan rolled away into the mist, Maggie stood with the muffin bag in hand and the last sips of coffee cooling in her cup. She didn't know why she'd said yes. She only knew that for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel entirely alone on that roadside in the woods, and that, somehow, felt like the beginning of something. Paul Whitman sat in the quiet of his hotel room, the late afternoon light slanting through half-closed blinds. Outside, the wind carried the scent of pine and wet pavement, but inside, everything was still. He'd spent years in corner offices, with panoramic views, surrounded by polished furniture and the buzz of assistants and boardroom tension. Now, the silence was deafening. He reached for his notebook, the worn, leather-bound one he'd been carrying since he left the company 4 months ago, and opened it to a blank page. His pen hovered, then dropped to the table. There were too many words he could write, and none that seemed right. Instead, he pulled an old photo from the inside flap. It was a grainy image from a company picnic, taken almost 5 years ago. Employees, in t-shirts and sunglasses, kids running in the background. He found her in the frame almost immediately, Maggie, sitting on a folding chair near the grill, laughing at something someone had said, a soda can in one hand, her hair pulled back, in a messy ponytail. He'd forgotten how young she looked then, how open. She'd been one of the best in her division, sharp, creative, and a rare combination of technical brilliance and moral backbone. Paul had noticed her early on, not just for her skills, but because she asked the kind of questions most people avoided. She wasn't just interested in how things worked. She wanted to know what happened when they didn't, what it meant, who it hurt. It had impressed him, and eventually terrified him. He leaned back in the chair, rubbing a hand over his face. 3 years ago, when Maggie had submitted a report about the brake sensor defects in a new hybrid model, Paul had read every word. He hadn't dismissed her, he hadn't doubted her. In fact, he'd brought the report to the VP of Product Development personally and was told in no uncertain terms to let it go. "There's no statistical risk," they'd said. "We can tweak the algorithm in the next release. Launch stays. On track." Maggie hadn't let it go. She pushed, spoke up in meetings, contacted compliance. By the time it reached the board, the issue had become political. She'd embarrassed people. The CEO before Paul had simply called it insubordination. And when Paul took over in a rushed transition, one of his first executive decisions was to quietly downsize disruptive personnel. He'd signed the memo. It was just a line in a document, just a name among 10 others. He never expected to see her again, certainly not in the middle of a rain-soaked roadside, elbow deep in an engine, handing him coffee with calloused hands and guarded eyes. And yet there she was. She hadn't recognized him. Not yet. But Paul remembered her perfectly. He stood and walked to the window, watching the clouds roll over the treetops. In all his years, he'd learned that time didn't always soften guilt. It just buried it beneath meetings and quarterly goals. Retirement hadn't cleansed him. It had only stripped away the noise. And now Maggie's face had brought the silence crashing down. The next morning, Paul returned to the turnout. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, that she'd be gone, perhaps, or that she wouldn't speak to him again. But when he pulled up, her RV was there, parked neatly beneath the pines, the morning sun glinting off the solar panel she'd rigged to the roof. Maggie was outside, kneeling by a beat-up Jeep Cherokee, tightening a bolt with focused precision. She looked up as he approached. "You're early. Coffee?" He hesitated. "I brought some, black this time." She smirked. "You're learning." They settled into the same spots as before. Her on the step, him in the folding chair. The Jeep's owner, a man in his 20s, stood nearby, watching awkwardly as Maggie finished the job. She wiped her hands on a rag and gave the man a thumbs up. He thanked her, handed her a $20 bill, and drove off with the look of someone who couldn't quite believe his luck. Paul watched her. "You know," he said quietly, "you're helping a lot of people out here." She shrugged. "They need help. I have tools. It's not complicated." "It is," he said. "It's rare." She looked at him then, not with suspicion this time, but with a flicker of curiosity. "You ever lose everything, Paul?" She asked. He blinked. "I suppose so, depending on how you define everything." "I had an apartment," she said, eyes scanning the trees. "A career I loved. Friends I thought would have my back. One week I had it all. The next I was packing boxes, clearing out my desk and realizing no one would even look me in the eye on the way out." Paul swallowed. "That shouldn't have happened." "No," she agreed. "But it did." She stood, dusting off her hands. "I'm not angry anymore. I was, for a long time. But anger's heavy, and I've got enough weight in this RV already." He smiled. A faint, rueful thing. "You sound like someone who's been through the storm." "I am the storm," she replied, then added, "or at least that's what I tell myself when the engine dies in the middle of Wyoming." Paul chuckled, and for the first time, it wasn't strained. She laughed too. A short, surprised sound, as if she hadn't done it in a while. There was a pause. Then she looked at him, her expression softer than before. "You're not just passing through, are you?" "No," he said quietly. "I came here for a reason. I just didn't know what it was until I met you." She tilted her head, studying him again, as if trying to see what he wasn't saying, and, for a moment, Paul wondered what it would feel like, to finally tell the truth, but not yet. Not here. The rust beneath the paint had started to show, but some things needed more time to be stripped away. The sun peeked through the pine canopy like a cautious guest, scattering golden light onto the worn metal of Maggie's RV. The day was unusually warm for October, and the chill that normally clung to the mountain air had retreated just enough for her to work without gloves. She was elbow-deep in the undercarriage of a '96 Ford Ranger, the kind of truck that still ran on sheer stubbornness. Tools were scattered on a faded tarp beneath her, and Paul, true to form, stood nearby, holding a flashlight that he kept forgetting to aim correctly. "Left a little," she muttered. Paul adjusted. The beam finally caught the spot she needed. "There. Hold it." She tightened the last bolt, then slid out from under the truck with a groan and a satisfied grunt. Her hands were streaked with grease, her cheeks flushed with effort. She reached for a towel and wiped her palms, then tossed it at Paul without looking. "You're improving. Last time you blinded me twice." "I consider that a compliment," he said, catching the rag mid-air. She cracked a smile and stood, brushing gravel from her jeans. "You're persistent, I'll give you that. You let me keep coming back. Didn't say I was smart." Paul chuckled. He looked around the clearing, taking in the quiet rhythm of Maggie's life. The little workbench she'd bolted to the RV exterior, the milk crate full of old spark plugs, the battered thermos that never seemed to run out of coffee. There was a sense of order to it all, a deliberate, rugged kind of peace. But what caught his eye was the toolbox. It sat just outside the RV door, old, metal, dented in 3 places, its handle wrapped in faded red tape. Paul walked over and crouched beside it. "This yours?" Maggie glanced over. "Yeah, my dad's originally." He looked up. "He was a mechanic," she said, her voice softening. "Owned a small shop in upstate New York. Never made much money, but everyone trusted him. Said he had magic in his hands." Paul ran a finger along the dented lid. "Looks like it's seen some things." "It has," she said. "He gave it to me the day I graduated from engineering school. Said, no matter how smart you get, never stop working with your hands. They'll remind you who you are." Paul nodded slowly. "Sounds like he was a good man." "He was the best man I've ever known." She crouched beside him and opened the box. Inside, the tools were arranged with almost reverent precision. Wrenches, sockets, a ratchet set that looked older than either of them. Tucked in the corner was a small photo, yellowed with time. A younger Maggie, maybe 8 or 9, standing, beside a tall, broad-shouldered man in a grease-stained apron. Both were smiling at the camera, like they had the whole world ahead of them. "He passed away right before I lost my job," she said. "Heart failure, quick, unexpected." Paul was quiet. "I think losing him was what broke me," she continued. "The job, that was just the final shove." Paul stared at the photo, then back at her. "I'm sorry," she shrugged. "Everyone's sorry." He looked at her carefully. "I don't think you're broken." Maggie didn't reply. After a while, she closed the box gently and locked the latch. "Anyway, that toolbox has fixed a lot of things. Old trucks, coffee machines, one time a church organ." Paul smiled. "You're a Renaissance mechanic," she gave him a mock salute. "All part of the service." There was a pause, a shift in the air between them. Something unspoken began pressing to the surface. Paul cleared his throat. "I've been thinking, maybe it's time you came back." She raised an eyebrow. "To what exactly?" "To the field, the industry. You're too skilled to be out here patching up brake pads on the side of the road." Her smile faded. "I'm serious," he said. "There are places that would value someone like you. You could consult, teach, lead." Maggie crossed her arms, voice low. "And who's going to let me do that? The industry that labeled me a liability and kicked me out without a second glance. I know people," he said gently. "People who still believe in integrity, in the right kind of fight." She stared at him, eyes narrowed. "And what about you, Paul? What exactly did you believe when I was shown the door?" He didn't flinch. "That I failed you." Silence. It was the first time he'd come close to admitting anything, and the weight of it hung between them like a low storm cloud. Maggie's face didn't change, but something in her posture shifted. Less tension, more exhaustion. "I don't want to go back," she said quietly. "Not to that version of myself. Not to that world. Paul nodded slowly, accepting her words. Fair enough. She turned, walked over to the thermos and poured herself a cup of coffee. Then, after a pause, poured a second and handed it to him. I'm not ready for a redemption arc, she muttered, but you're welcome to hold the flashlight a little longer. He took the cup, smiled. That's the best offer I've had all week. They stood in the clearing, drinking in silence, the air thick with scent of pine and oil and burnt toast from a nearby camper stove. After a long while, Paul said, You know, the first time I heard your name, they told me you were a problem. Maggie snorted. They weren't wrong, but I think they were afraid of the wrong things, he said. They were afraid of someone who gave a damn. Maggie didn't answer, but her grip on the coffee cup softened. She looked out toward the horizon, where clouds were starting to gather again. The light would fade soon. Another storm coming. But for now, just for this moment, there was warmth. There was space. And maybe, just maybe, there was a beginning of something being fixed that wasn't made of bolts or wires, just two people, sitting with what had been broken and not looking away. The first cold snap of fall had arrived overnight. Slipping through the forest like a quiet thief, Maggie pulled her flannel tighter around her shoulders as she sipped her coffee outside the RV, steam rising from the cup in delicate spirals. Paul was late. She didn't know why that unsettled her. For the past 2 weeks he'd shown up nearly every morning, sometimes with muffins, sometimes with coffee, always with that quiet way of listening that made her feel strangely heard. He asked questions without judgment. He didn't hover. He didn't push. And yet, she could feel something pressing in the space between them. Something he hadn't said. Something she hadn't wanted to guess. When his sedan finally pulled into the turnout, the tires crunching on gravel, Maggie felt her stomach twist. She told herself it was the coffee, the cold, anything but what it really was, the creeping sense that today would be different. Paul stepped out without his usual smile. His hands were in his coat pockets. The sun was behind him, casting a long shadow over the damp ground. "Morning," she said cautiously. "Morning." His voice was steady, but something in it felt heavier. He didn't carry coffee this time. She nodded toward the folding chair. "Take a seat. I won't make you work today." He didn't sit. "I need to tell you something," he said instead. Maggie froze. It was the way he said it, not casual, not rehearsed, but like a man preparing to hand over something that had been burning in his hands for too long. She set her mug down on the RV step. "All right," she said. Paul exhaled through his nose slowly. Then he looked at her, straight on. No dodging, no softening. "I was the CEO," he said. "When you were fired." The words landed like a tire iron to the gut. Not a loud crash, just a sudden heavy silence. Maggie didn't speak. "I wasn't in the room," Paul continued, "but I signed the paper. I read the report you submitted. I believed you. I knew you were right. But the board, myself included, decided to shut it down. The launch was too close. There was too much money at stake. And I let it happen." Still, she said nothing. "I've thought about it every day since I stepped down," he went on, voice cracking just slightly. "Retirement didn't cleanse me. It just gave me time to realize how much I'd let go of, for the sake of looking like I was in control." Maggie looked down at her boots. The damp dirt clung to the soles like regret. "So why now?" She asked finally. "Why here? Why me?" He swallowed. "Because I couldn't keep pretending I didn't owe you the truth. And because when I saw you out here still helping people, still being the person I failed to stand beside, I realized I didn't just fire an employee. I betrayed someone I respected." Maggie stood slowly, arms crossed, the forest quiet around her. "You remember what I said to you last week?" she asked, voice low. Paul nodded. "You said anger's heavy." I lied. She took a step toward him, eyes sharp, voice rising. "Not in volume, but in precision. I was furious, Paul. Not because I lost a job, not even because I lost a reputation, but because I used to look up to people like you. I thought if I worked hard, did things right, stood up when it mattered, someone up there would back me. I know, he whispered. I spent months thinking I was crazy, she said, her voice cracking now, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing, if maybe I had been too loud, too difficult, too inconvenient. You weren't. She stared at him, blinking away the heat behind her eyes. It wasn't just the company that let me go. It was the people who couldn't even look me in the eye when I cleared my desk. Paul looked down. I never forgot your face, he said. Even then, that silenced her. She turned away, walked a few steps toward the trees, then stopped. When I saw you that day on the side of the road, I didn't recognize you, she said. And I think part of me didn't want to, because if I had, I don't know if I would have helped you. Paul approached slowly, but stopped short of touching distance. I'm glad you did. She let out a breath, slow and shaky. I don't know what you expect me to do with this, she said, gesturing vaguely to the space between them. There's no fixing it. I know, he said. I didn't come here to fix the past. I came to be honest about it. They stood there in silence, leaves fluttering in a slow breeze, the first hints of gold and rust settling into the branches above them. Finally, Maggie turned back toward the RV. I need time, of course, and I need you to leave. For now, he nodded. I understand. She walked to the RV step, picked up her coffee, now gone cold, and sat. Paul took a step back. I'll go, but thank you for hearing me. She didn't respond. He lingered a moment, then turned and walked to the sedan. As the engine faded down the gravel road, Maggie sat motionless. The silence wasn't peaceful this time. It was cracked open, raw. But somewhere deep beneath it, under the rust and rain of old betrayals, something like clarity began to settle in. The truth didn't heal everything, but maybe, just maybe, it had stopped the bleeding. The storm rolled in like a memory, slow at first, with a steady wind that carried the faint scent of rain and pine resin. By late afternoon, the clouds had thickened, casting a moody hush over the hills, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Maggie worked in silence beneath the overhang of a sagging gas station awning off Route 6, coaxing life back into a rust-stained Subaru that had coughed its last breath somewhere between the interstate and nowhere. A young couple stood nearby, holding hands, their gratitude obvious in every glance. Maggie barely spoke. Her hands moved by instinct, but her mind had been 1,000 miles away for days. It had been 4 days since Paul told her the truth. 4 days since she'd asked him to leave, and he had. No calls, no texts, no unexpected visits with muffins and coffee. She'd thought the silence would bring peace. It hadn't. It had brought noise of a different kind, the kind that echoed inside her chest. 1,000 memories she didn't ask for, a parade of unfinished thoughts. She wasn't angry anymore, not really. That emotion had burned hot and fast, then collapsed into something colder, heavier. Disappointment. Not in him, strangely, but in herself, for still caring, for wanting him to be better, for wishing, even now, that he would come back. She finished the repair, gave the couple a soft smile, and waved away their offer of cash. They drove off into the dusk, headlights twin halos in the mist. Maggie stood, stretched her aching back, and looked to the sky. The wind shifted. Thunder rumbled low and distant. She had just started packing her tools when she heard the tires skidding on gravel behind her. She turned, heart already rising into her throat. It was the black sedan. Again. The driver's door opened before the engine fully stopped. Paul stepped out, soaked to the knees, his coat whipping in the wind. His hair was damp, his face drawn, but his eyes were locked on hers with urgent clarity. "Maggie," he said, voice sharp with something close to panic, "I need your help." She blinked. "You've got a real knack for showing up in storms." He strode closer, breathless. "It's serious. I wouldn't come otherwise." She crossed her arms, wary. "I told you I needed space." "I know. But this isn't about me." It's about you, about the report you filed, the one they buried. Her. Arms dropped. What about it? Paul glanced around, then lowered his voice. There's a whistleblower lawsuit. Someone inside the company found old documentation, emails, sign-offs, suppression orders. Your report was the trigger. And they're trying to say you never filed it. Maggie's stomach flipped. Of course I filed it. I know, but they've erased most digital traces. Meeting minutes were lost. Emails were deleted. If they win this case, they walk away clean. But if we find your original submission, I submitted it through internal protocol. Do you have a copy? Maggie hesitated. A memory stirred, faint but vivid, her father's voice in her ear. Always keep a backup. Trust the wrench in your hand more than the suits in a boardroom. She had burned most of her old life when she hit the road, but not everything. I might, she said quietly. Back in the RV, in the box. The toolbox? Paul asked. She nodded. He didn't press further. He just waited. She walked quickly to the RV, Paul on her heels. Inside, she opened the lower cabinet beneath her cot and pulled out a dusty tin, once used for socket wrenches, now repurposed for odds and ends she hadn't been able to let go. At the bottom, under an envelope of old pay stubs and a cracked USB drive, was a flash drive labeled Break Analysis, MH. She held it in her palm, suddenly unsure. Do you know what you're asking me to do? She said. I do, Paul replied. I also know you don't owe me anything, but this could stop them, really stop them. Maggie turned the drive over, her thumb tracing the ridges. What do you want me to do with it? Come with me, he said. Meet with the investigators. Give them your story, your real story. With this in your hand, you'll have more credibility than any lawyer they can buy. She stared at him. For years, she'd run from that life, from the suits and the hierarchy and the feeling that her voice didn't matter. But now her voice might matter more than ever, and despite everything, she believed him, not because of his title, not even because of his apology, but because in his face, creased with regret, weathered by truth, she saw something rare. Conviction and something else, unspoken but undeniable. Respect. She pocketed the flash drive. Let's go. The storm broke just as they hit the highway. Rain lashed against the windshield in frantic rhythms, the kind that muffled the world into grey silence. Inside the car, Maggie sat stiffly, fingers gripping the armrest, her mind racing through questions she hadn't had time to ask. You think this will actually matter? She asked. Paul kept his eyes on the road. It already does. They drove through the storm in silence, but the silence felt different this time. Not avoidance. Readiness. Hours later, they pulled into a dim parking lot outside a plain brick building marked Federal Safety Commission, Regional Office. Paul cut the engine and turned to her. You can back out, he said. Even now. She looked at him. I've spent too long being quiet, she said. Time someone heard the truth, while I'm still the one to tell it. Paul smiled, but it was solemn. You're brave. She opened the door. No, I'm done being scared. And with that, she stepped into the rain, taller than the storm. The fluorescent lights in the conference room buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the dull beige walls and linoleum floor. Maggie sat across from two federal investigators, a half-drunk cup of vending machine coffee at her elbow, her fingers loosely wrapped around a flash drive. She had driven through thunderstorms, through doubt, through 3 years of silence to be here, but what surprised her most was that she didn't feel afraid. Not anymore. The agent across from her, agent Ruiz, mid-50s, silver hair, eyes sharp with quiet fatigue, leaned forward. Miss Harper, I want to thank you for coming in. We know this couldn't have been easy. Maggie gave a dry smile. After replacing alternators in Wyoming during hailstorms, this is practically a spa day, Ruiz chuckled softly. Fair enough. Next to her, Paul sat quietly, his coat still damp at the shoulders from the rain. He hadn't said much during the drive or the initial interview. He was here as a witness, not a savior. Maggie appreciated that. She slid the flash drive across the table. "This has everything," she said. "My original findings, test data, internal emails. I kept copies because something told me I'd need them someday." Ruiz nodded and handed it to a technician waiting by the door. "There's one more thing," Maggie added, voice firm. "I want to make a formal statement, on the record, about what I witnessed, what I reported, and how I was treated." Ruiz met her gaze. "That's your right. We'll take your statement now." The next hour unfolded with the slow, methodical gravity of truth being put back together. Maggie detailed everything: the brake failure anomalies, the suppressed memos, the meetings where she was told to be quiet, the day she walked into work and found a cardboard box on her desk. The agents asked questions, clarified timelines, listened carefully. Her voice only trembled once, when she spoke about her father and how she used to believe that integrity could stand up to pressure. Paul never interrupted. When it was done, Ruiz leaned back in his chair and exhaled. "I'll be honest with you," he said. "This changes everything. Your testimony, paired with this documentation, gives us a case we didn't think we had." Maggie nodded slowly, not triumphant, just steady. "I'm not doing this for revenge," she said. "I'm doing it because people deserve to know someone tried to stop it." Ruiz's face softened. "That's the kind of statement juries remember." As they left the office, the rain had thinned into a light drizzle, as if even the storm was beginning to lose its edge. Maggie stood beside Paul beneath the awning, her breath visible in the cold air. "So," she said, crossing her arms, "what now?" Paul looked at her, his expression hard to read. "They'll investigate. The company will fight back. There'll be subpoenas, headlines, depositions. It's going to get loud." She smirked. "I've lived in an RV with a broken exhaust pipe. I can handle loud." He smiled at that. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. She turned toward him, eyes narrowed. Don't what? Don't make this about me being brave. I'm not interested in being anyone's redemption story. Not yours, not theirs." Paul nodded. "Fair." They walked together toward the parking lot. Maggie paused, beside his car. "Paul," she said, her voice softer now, "why are you really doing this?" He looked at her, then away. "Because I saw something in myself I didn't like. A man who let silence do harm. I can't undo the past, but I can. Stop pretending I didn't have a hand in it." She studied him. "And maybe," he added, "because somewhere in the middle of all this, I started caring what you think of me." Maggie let out a breath that felt heavier than she expected. "That's not nothing," she said. He gave a small smile. "Not everything either." "No," she agreed, "but it's a start." They returned to the turnout by evening. The clouds had cleared, revealing a pale wash of stars above the trees. Maggie's RV stood undisturbed, a steady presence against the dark forest. Inside, she brewed fresh coffee while Paul leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. She handed him a mug and sat on the step. "You ever fix something you didn't think was fixable?" he asked. Maggie sipped her drink. "Engines all the time, people, jury's still out." Paul chuckled. "That toolbox of yours might be magic." She looked at it, still resting beside the cot, the red tape worn soft with time. "It's not the tools," she said. "It's knowing when to use them and when to walk away." He nodded. "I'm not asking you for anything," he said, voice low. "Not forgiveness, not whatever this might have become between us." She didn't respond. "I just want you to know," he continued, "that I'll be around, whether it's helping the case, driving parts cross-country, or just holding the flashlight." Maggie stared into her cup for a long moment, then quietly, "You still don't hold it steady." He laughed. "Working on it." They sat in silence for a long time, the kind of silence that didn't need fixing, the kind you could grow something outside, the trees swayed gently in the wind, and somewhere far off, thunder rolled one last time, softer now, like an old wound finally closing. The headline broke 3 days later. Whistleblowers' evidence exposes cover-up at auto giant. CEO steps down amid federal probe. Maggie saw it on a cracked television screen in the corner of a diner off Route 17, the sound muted, but the news crawl relentless. She stared at it for a long time, a half-eaten plate of eggs cooling in front of her. She hadn't expected it to happen so fast. Paul had done it. He'd stepped down. There was no press conference, no public statement, just a quiet resignation followed by a brief note to the board citing personal accountability. That was all. It should have felt like victory, but Maggie didn't feel triumphant. She felt still. Like a storm had passed, but the air hadn't settled yet. She paid for her breakfast, stepped into the cool autumn air, and walked slowly back, toward the turnout where her RV sat waiting beneath a golden canopy of turning leaves. The sky above was soft blue, streaked with faint clouds, and the breeze carried the scent of wood smoke and pine. A box sat on the RV's step. Inside, an envelope with her name, and beneath it, several thick folders, legal documents, press summaries, a check she didn't dare look at, and a handwritten letter. In Paul's careful script, she read the note 3 times. Maggie, I didn't want to leave this at your door, but I figured you'd prefer it that way. I've done what I can. I've stepped away for good this time, not just from the company, but from who I used to be inside it. You once said, engines don't judge people. Maybe that's true. But people can change if they want it badly enough. If you ever decide to build something again, something that matters, know that I'd be honored to hold the flashlight. Paul. Maggie stood there for a long time, the letter trembling slightly in her hands. Then she set it down, took a deep breath, and opened the RV door. The next morning she got to work. The garage she found was abandoned. An old Quonset hut on the edge of a faded farm town, with a rusted sign hanging crookedly above the bay doors that read McAllister's Auto and Farm Repair. Ivy curled through the chain-link fence, and the concrete floor was cracked like old skin, but the bones were good, solid. She bought the place with the settlement funds from the federal case. Not because she wanted to get back into business, because she wanted to build something that didn't depend on boardrooms or balance sheets. Something for people like her, women who'd been shut out, overlooked, or tossed aside. She called it second gear, a garage, a training space, a chance to begin again. By Thanksgiving, the place was humming, not with engines, though there were plenty of those, but with voices, laughter, tools clinking on metal. Maggie walked between workbenches with a clipboard in one hand and a mug in the other, pausing to help a young woman align a torque wrench or offer a word of encouragement to a mother of 2 learning to change her first set of brake pads. They weren't mechanics yet, but they were trying, and trying, Maggie had learned, was enough. That afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the trees cast long shadows across the lot, a familiar car pulled up to the gravel drive. Paul stepped out, dressed in jeans and a flannel, his hair longer, streaked more with grey, but his face quieter, less polished, more real. He walked toward her slowly, hands in his pockets. "You opened early," he said. "Couldn't wait." He nodded, eyes sweeping the space. "It's beautiful. It's greasy." "I meant that in the best possible way." She smiled, tired but content. "Come to judge my wiring." "Nope, just here to visit. Maybe sweep the floor." He meant it. She could see that. They walked together around the garage, past the fresh tool racks, the bins of donated parts, the wall of thanks where former students had started tacking photos and handwritten notes of appreciation. "It's everything you talked about," Paul said, reading a note from a single mom named Elise who'd just gotten her first mechanic's apprentice job. "You made it real. I had help. You didn't ask for it." "No," she said, "but sometimes it finds you anyway." They stood in silence, the way they always did, like they'd earned the right not to fill the space with noise. Then Paul said, "There's something I've wanted to ask." She looked up. "Not about us. About you." Maggie waited. "When everything fell apart," he said, "what made you keep going?" She considered it, then nodded toward the toolbox sitting by her office door. The old one with the red tape. Still dented, still loyal. "My dad used to say, you fix what you can, the rest you learn to carry with grace." Paul followed her gaze. "Is that what this is?" he asked. "Grace?" "No," she said softly. "This is hope. Grace is what gets you through the waiting. Hope is what makes you build again." He smiled, then gently, "And us?" Maggie didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked around. Her shop, at the people she was teaching, the engines being rebuilt, the parts being brought back to life. "We're somewhere in between," she said finally. "Still a little rust, but the frame's solid." Paul nodded. "I can work with that." She handed him a broom. "Then start with the floor." He laughed, and together they moved through the golden light, the dust and metal and possibility. Outside, the last leaves of autumn swirled gently across the gravel, and in the distance, the sound of a wrench clicking into place echoed like music through the open doors of second gear. The first snow came earlier than expected. Not a blizzard, just a soft dusting, barely enough to coat the top of the pine trees or whisper along the edges of the road. The sky was pale, the air crisp, and the garage at second gear was warm with the hum of activity and the smell of old engines being brought back to life. Maggie stood at the open bay door, a mug of coffee warming her hands, watching the flakes swirl and dissolve into the gravel. The light outside was fading into that quiet blue of late afternoon, when the world seems to hold its breath before darkness arrives. Behind her, someone laughed. Jess, one of the new trainees, was telling a story about her first time using a tire iron, and everyone was cracking up. The room buzzed with a kind of electricity Maggie hadn't realized she missed. A life being lived, not perfectly but purposefully. She turned just as Paul stepped through the side door, brushing snow off his jacket. He carried a cardboard box in his arms and a hopeful grin on his face. "I brought something," he said. Maggie raised a brow. "Is it coffee? Because I already made the good kind." He shook his head, setting the box down on the workbench near the heater. "Better." She approached cautiously, peering inside. At first it looked like junk, wires, broken dials, a cracked housing shell. But then she saw it, a vintage analog multimeter, a beauty from the 60s, busted, but not beyond saving. "I found it at a flea market up north," Paul said. "Figured it deserved a second chance." Maggie smiled despite herself. "You're catching on." They sat together at the bench, shoulder to shoulder, the way they often did now, not too close, not too far, just enough to share space without pressure. She began disassembling the unit, her fingers moving with practiced precision. Paul handed her tools when she asked, quiet, patient. "You know," she said, as she carefully pried open the casing, "there was a time I thought this would never be possible." "This?" he asked. "All of it," she said. "This shop, these women, sitting here with you." Paul nodded slowly. "You had every reason to walk away from all of it, including me." Maggie glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "I almost did. What stopped you?" She set the screwdriver down, stared at the circuit board for a long moment. "I remembered who I was before they made me doubt it," she said. "Before I started measuring my worth by how quietly I could exist." Paul looked at her with something like awe. "You don't realize it, do you?" "What?" "How much you've rebuilt, not just here, but in the people around you." Maggie shrugged. "That's what fixing is, Paul. You don't start with the shiny parts. You start with the cracked ones. And you don't do it because it's easy. You do it because someone has to." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. The Snow thickened outside, the flakes swirling more steadily now, blurring the trees beyond the garage. After a while, Paul stood, walked to the open bay door, and stared into the falling white. "I've been thinking about where I go from here," he said quietly. Maggie didn't answer. She kept working. "I've had offers, boards, think tanks, some media requests," she smirked. "Let me guess, redemption stories sell." Apparently, she set the multimeter's faceplate aside and looked up at him. "And what do you want?" He turned to her, leaned against the doorframe. "I want to be useful, not just visible." Maggie tilted her head. "Big difference. I spent 30 years trying to be the guy in the suit with the answers," he said. "Turns out I like being the guy holding the flashlight better." She smiled at that, genuine, amused, and warmer than she meant to let show. "You're not bad at it," she admitted. "I'm learning." They stood in comfortable quiet for a while, the shop behind them slowing down for the day, tools being cleaned, laughter softening into casual conversation. Then Paul said, "There's something else." Maggie raised a brow. He took a breath, then stepped closer, not too close, just enough to be heard without raising his voice. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "Not now. Maybe not ever. But I need you to know, whatever this is, whatever it becomes, I'm here. Not out of guilt, not out of obligation, just because I want to be." Maggie's gaze didn't waver. She studied him the way she studied old engines, slow, deliberate, searching for the crack beneath the polish, and what she saw surprised her. There was no polish left, just a man, tired but true, standing in the cold with his hands open and his pride set down somewhere far behind him. She took a step forward, then looked out at the snow. "My dad used to say," she began, "that the best relationships are like old trucks. They're not always smooth. Sometimes they rattle. Sometimes they stall. But if you keep the oil changed and listen when something sounds off, they'll carry you farther than anything new ever could." Paul smiled, his breath clouding in the air. "He sounds like a wise man." He was. She turned back to him, her voice soft. "I'm not ready, I know, but I'm not shutting the door either." Paul nodded. "That's more than enough." She reached past him and gently pulled the garage door halfway closed, just enough to keep the snow out, just enough to leave the world a little more private. "Come back tomorrow," she said. "I will. Bring your broom. I always do." And just like that, they stood in the golden light of closing time, amid the scent of oil and snow and possibility, not at the beginning, not at the end, but exactly where they needed to be. It was a quiet morning, the kind Maggie loved best, before the tools started clinking, before the coffee pot gurgled its second batch, before the shop filled with voices and the low rumble of engines being coaxed back to life. The world was hushed. Under a soft coat of snow, the trees dressed in white, the sky a pale stretch of silver. She sat by the window inside her office, a chipped ceramic mug warming her hands, her breath faint against the cold glass. The heater clicked gently behind. Everything felt still, grounded, balanced. On her desk sat a letter, the kind not sent by email or courier, the kind written in longhand, on thick paper with pauses between the sentences you could feel even as you read them. It wasn't from Paul. It was a letter she had written to her father. She hadn't meant to write it, not really, but the words had come the night before, unprompted, as if they'd been waiting patiently all these years to find their way onto the page. "Dad, you were right about the toolbox, about the world, about people. You always said, fix what you can, carry the rest with grace. I used to think that meant surviving, but I see now it means something deeper. It means we keep building, even when we're tired, even when we've been broken ourselves. You never got to see what I built here, but I think you'd like it. It smells like grease and burnt coffee. It hums like something alive. And it's full of people who've been told they weren't enough until they picked up a wrench and realized they always were. I carry you here. In every bolt I tighten, every young woman I teach, every second chance I hand out like socket sets. Thank you for the tools, not just the ones in the box. Love, Maggie. She folded the letter, slid it into the drawer with quiet reverence, and looked out at the snow-covered lot. Students were arriving now. Jess, Elise, Nadine, wrapped in coats and scarves, laughing as they stomped snow from their boots. The garage lights flickered on one by one, and the space began to glow. A few minutes later, Paul's sedan pulled in, slow and steady, and Maggie felt the familiar nudge in her chest. Not butterflies, not nerves. Just something gentle, steady, like warmth spreading into cold fingers. He walked in carrying a box of pastries and his usual crooked grin. "You know," she said as she passed him a mug of coffee, "we're going to have to put you on payroll if you keep showing up like this." Paul shrugged. "I accept payment in grease-stained wisdom and stale donuts. Lucky for you, we're fully stocked." They moved into the garage together, weaving through the morning rhythm of laughter, banter, tools clattering. It was a world she had built not out of ambition, but out of necessity. A shelter, a forge, a place where broken things became whole. Again, and not just the engines, Maggie watched as Paul helped a new trainee lift the hood of an old Volvo, guiding her through the steps gently, patiently. He'd never pretended to know more than he did. He just showed up every day, without fanfare. That, Maggie had learned, was its own kind of love. Not the loud kind, the steady kind, the trustworthy kind. By noon, the snow had melted into slush at the edges of the lot. Sunlight broke through the clouds, casting warm gold across the garage floor. Maggie wiped her hands on a rag and stepped outside, letting the light touch her face. Paul followed, standing beside her in comfortable silence. "You ever think," she said quietly, "about how strange it all is? How one broken alternator on a rainy road turned into this?" He smiled. "Strange doesn't feel like the right word. Feels more like earned." She looked at him. Really looked. There were still lines around his eyes, the weight of choices and regrets etched into the corners. But there was also peace. The kind that only comes when a man stops running from who he used to be and decides who he wants to become. "You still hold the flashlight crooked," she teased. He grinned. "I like to keep you humble." They both laughed. A light breeze kicked up, carrying the scent of snow and warm metal and fresh coffee. Somewhere inside, someone turned on the radio. An old song came through, soft, familiar, full of the kind of nostalgia that made your chest ache in the best way. Paul looked at her, his voice lower now. "I never expected to find this," he said. "Not the shop, not the people, not you." Maggie's eyes softened. "Neither did I." They stood together, facing the shop, and the world, for once, felt exactly as it should be. That evening, as twilight settled and the last of the students headed home, Maggie locked up the garage and turned off the lights. Paul waited by the RV, as he often did, watching the snow begin to fall again in slow, quiet flakes. She reached for her keys, then paused. "You want to stay for dinner?" she asked. "I've got stew in the slow cooker, enough for two." He looked surprised, not because she asked, but because this time there was no hesitation in her voice. "I'd like that," he said. They stepped into the RV, the door closing behind them with a soft click. Outside, the snow kept falling, and beneath it all, beneath the rust, the rain, the regrets and repairs, something steady and warm pulsed into life. Not a second chance. Something better. A future. Made not of what was lost, but of what had been quietly, stubbornly, lovingly rebuilt. If you made it this far, thank you. I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Whether you're in a small town, a big city, or somewhere in between, drop a comment and say hello. Your stories matter too, and if this story touched your heart, even just a little, consider subscribing. It helps more kind souls like you find their way here. Until next time, thank you for spending part of your day with me. Stay kind, stay curious, and never underestimate the power of a second chance.